Are you thinking about buying a MacBook Pro right now? Apple isn't making this an easy decision at the moment, but I'm going to try and fix that for you. Welcome back to Mark Ellis Reviews, and thank you as always for subscribing. And if you haven't subscribed, just click the button below. So of all the M1 Macs that you can currently buy right now, there's one that sticks out like a sore thumb, and that is the M1 MacBook Pro. Now over the M1 MacBook Air, it only offers a few noticeable upgrades. One of them is the fact it has a fan on the M1 chip, which means in theory it won't throttle the speed, it won't slow it down if you do lots and lots of intensive work on it. The other one is the screen brightness. It has more nits, which basically means it can get brighter. That's kind of it. It's got the touch bar, but as far as we know, that is something that is going to be a legacy thing very soon, as far as Apple are concerned. It's more expensive. It doesn't make much sense. Despite this, you might still want an M1 MacBook Pro. I get that. It's a very desirable laptop. It always has been. But I think it's a really bad buy at the moment. And in this video, I'm going to explain why that's the case. And also, if you do genuinely need a MacBook Pro at the moment, I do think there's another option, which I'll get onto in a moment. So why shouldn't you buy an M1 MacBook Pro right now? Well, as far as we know, and these are just rumors, so that I have to caveat this with that, Apple is allegedly going to be launching or announcing a new MacBook Pro at WWDC in June, which is next month. As far as we know, that's going to be a completely new design, a new version of the M series chip. It might include things like more ports, it could have Face ID, it can have all sorts of weird and wonderful things. Key thing being, it's going to be a new MacBook Pro design, and we've not had one of these since 2016. There's also new screen sizes, so there'll be a new 14-inch, and okay, it's not a new screen size, but the 16-inch allegedly is going to be updated to an M series chip, and that is really exciting. So imagine if you bought an M1 MacBook Pro now, the 13-inch version, and then a month later, Apple announces this wonderful replacement for it. There's nothing worse than buyer's remorse, and this could be a classic case of that. And if we just go back to those differences between the M1 MacBook Air and the M1 MacBook Pro, I do think it's very difficult to justify the additional price of that M1 MacBook Pro. In my experience, I have an M1 Mac Mini. Now that's pretty much the same computer as the M1 MacBook Pro. It has a fan in there. I've never heard the fan come on, ever. It never gets hot. And I do 4K video editing. That's probably the most intensive thing that I do, which is quite intensive for a computer. As an example, on my old 16-inch MacBook Pro, which has since departed the building, that used to get incredibly hot, incredibly loud with its fans if I was either rendering 4K video or exporting it. The M1 Mac Mini, it doesn't make a sound and it's ice cold to the touch. So although the M1 Mac Mini and the M1 MacBook Pro are technically different devices, they do share the same internals, and I just think that fan probably isn't worth the upgrade price on the M1 MacBook Pro. Screen brightness, that can be a big deal for some people if you are a video editor or you do a lot of work in outside bright spaces. That might benefit you possibly, but again, I don't think it's worth the price upgrade. Touch bar, that is on the way out, I'm afraid. It's one of those things that gets boring very quickly, and you very quickly realise how pointless it is. And if the rumours are to be believed, Apple are getting rid of it anyway, so it's not going to be supported for much longer. Battery life, you do get 2 hours additional battery life with the M1 MacBook Pro. That's pretty nice, that could be quite useful for certain people. But again, is it really worth spending the extra money for it when there's a new one on the way? The other thing you could do, if you really want one now, if you really want an M1 machine now, is get an M1 Mac Mini like I have, because that is, like I say, pretty much the same computer as the M1 MacBook Pro. And okay, it's a desktop machine, but if you've got the budget for it, and if you don't mind perhaps saving up a bit afterwards, it would mean that you could get a desktop-based Mac with an M1 chip in it to start experiencing that wonderful chip, and then wait and see what Apple does next month, and if they launch something which you think I need that as well, then save up for it, or if you, like I say, if you've got the budget for it, add that new MacBook, whatever it happens to be, the M2, M1X, whatever it is, add that as your portable device. It's pretty much what I do. So I have the M1 Mac Mini as my desktop device, and I have my trusty M1 MacBook Air as my portable go-to laptop. I understand why Apple launched the M1 MacBook Pro. It kind of made sense back in when it was launched in December, but it was always going to have a very short shelf life, and that's a shame actually for people that have bought it. I didn't really foresee this. I didn't think we'd see a significant update to the MacBook Pro design until probably a lot later this year, or probably at the start of 2022. So the rumours that we're going to see see something significant at WWDC this year. That surprised me, and it did make me sit back and think, that has given that M1 MacBook Pro a very short shelf life for a lot of people. And don't get me wrong, if you've bought one, don't start getting buyer's remorse about it, because it's still a fantastic laptop and you'll get many years of use out of it. And the other thing is, although Apple are going to apparently announce this new MacBook Pro at WWDC, that doesn't mean it will be available immediately afterwards. It might be that they say, look, here it is, this is what it looks like, it's coming later this year, in which case you may not even get one until winter. We just never know what Apple are going to do. They surprise you. It could launch immediately, it could be in 3 months' time, it could be something for early next year. We just don't know until they actually take to the stage and announce it. But what if you need a MacBook Pro now? Now, there are people and businesses out there that do genuinely need MacBook Pros literally right this moment. And those sort of people are professionals, perhaps with very old MacBook Pros that need replacing, and maybe creators, for example, or developers who are significantly hampered by an old MacBook Pro that is slowing them down. That's no good for business. It's no good for productivity. You can lose time, you can lose clients. That isn't good for your business. You may also have a task or a project that needs a very specific computer to get done, and you can perhaps calculate the ROI. So you build the cost of that machine into the entire project and it will still provide a return. You may also be someone who runs certain software which isn't compatible with the M series chips at all. And a good example of this actually is music production. So I use Logic Pro and I use some software synths by a company called Native Instruments. Native Instruments are brilliant and they pretty much always update their stuff pretty quickly. However, they haven't updated one or two of their synths, and one of those is a synth called Massive X. They may have fixed it by now if they have, fantastic, but it just doesn't work on the M1 at all. Now for me, I'm a hobbyist music producer, so it's not the end of the world, but if you're not that, if you're someone who makes a living from making music and you need these plugins to work and they don't work on an M1 chip, then you've got to do something else. So if you fall into any of those brackets and you genuinely need a MacBook Pro now, I wouldn't buy the M1 at all. I'd actually go Intel. Yeah, no, really. Several reasons for that. One of them is, as I've just mentioned, you've got far more supported software. So if your software that you need to run your business doesn't run on the M1 chip, then an Intel Mac is the only way you can go. You can also get more RAM. This does matter to people. I know there's a huge debate. I've got involved in it with the 8 versus 16 gig of RAM on the M1, and it's a very different conversation with that chip because it's a completely different type of chip to Intel chips. But some people do need lots and lots of RAM. They might need 32, 64 gig of RAM, whatever it might be. You can't get that on an M1 MacBook Pro, but you can get it on, for example, the 16-inch Intel-based MacBook Pro. On that note, you can get a bigger screen with that 16-inch. You can't get that with the M1 series MacBooks at the moment. You can get more ports, you can get up to 4 ports on a laptop. You can't do that with the M1 MacBook Pro at the moment. And if you're really into video editing or some form of graphics production, then you can upgrade the graphics card in the 16-inch MacBook Pro. Again, you can't do that with the M1 MacBook Pro. So you can see where Intel Macs still have a place for businesses and certain other industries. And that is why if you do genuinely need a MacBook Pro at the moment, I would go for an Intel Mac. There's a reason Apple is still selling these devices, and they're going to carry on selling them for another couple of years probably, and they'll support them for a fair while as well. They are transitioning to the M platform, but that's going to take time. They know they've got thousands, probably millions of people out there who use and rely on Intel Macs. So just because the M series chips are here now and we're starting to hear about even going beyond the M1, it doesn't make the Intel line of Macs completely defunct. It's still a great machine, and if you're losing time and revenue because of your decrepit old MacBook Pro, then don't get the M1 MacBook Pro. Get yourself a spec'd up Intel MacBook Pro. And to be honest, I would go for the 16-inch. The other thing to bear in mind is that once the new MacBook Pro is here, by the time you've finished with this new Intel one that you've bought, say 1, 2, 3 years down the line, then the M series MacBook Pros will be far more developed by that point. They'll have got to the point where hopefully most third-party software vendors will have jumped on board, and you can then jump into the M series world, having got all of that value, all of that ROI out of your MacBook Pro, the Intel-based version. Everyone's a winner. So what if you just want a MacBook Pro? And I've said this before in the past, there's nothing wrong with that. Just like the MacBook Air, the MacBook Pro is a desirable device for a lot of people, and you might just want to have a MacBook Pro. Buying one now, I think, would be a mistake. All you've got to do is wait until WWDC is here, listen to what Apple announce. From there, work out what you want to do. Because by then, if they do announce the brand new MacBook Pro at WWDC, you'll know when you can get it, whether or not you can get it quickly, or whether or not you'll have to wait until later in the year. And also, you'll be able to get an idea of what you'll get if you go for the new version. And it might be from your perspective that, as I mentioned earlier, you may not want to jump on early to the first iteration of a brand new product. It's not always the best idea to jump in early. I do that because I'm a reviewer. But if you're a consumer and you don't have a Mac that perhaps causes you issues and you encounter first version problems with it, then it makes sense to wait a little bit and wait for Apple to fix or iron out any issues that might come with that new version. So as I've always said, don't feel bad about just wanting a MacBook Pro now, but please, if you can, just hold back, hold your wallet closed, wait until WWDC is here, and then make your decision from there. Let me know how you feel about that. I'd love to know in the comments if you are thinking about buying a MacBook Pro now. Let me know how you feel about it. Are you worried about making that decision? Have you made that decision? Have you just bought an M1 MacBook Pro and thrown caution to the wind? That'd be interesting. Or are you waiting for the next MacBook Pro to be announced at WWDC? And more importantly, what do you want to see in it? Another decision that you might be trying to make at the moment, or perhaps someone that you know will be trying to make at the moment, is whether or not to buy the M1 Mac Mini or the brand new 24-inch iMac, which also includes the M1 chip. I've put a buying guide together for that, and if you carry on watching, you'll get a link to that video. But in the meantime, thank you as always for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next video.